Hello everyone, it's Kathy here, and today I'm going to share with you two cards that I've created, and I've used watercolor techniques to create them, and they're quite simple but the effects are really quite spectacular. I've also used Havana Nights collection from Kaisercraft, and I'm going to show you how you can use their dies and stamps to create these cards, which are quite simple to do. So firstly, I'll show you the products. I'm using the clear stamps from the collection and this paper, but this 12 by 12 sheet, which is called Tiled. I'm also going to be drawing inspiration from the colors in that particular paper. The stamps I'm showing you, again, they're clear stamps called Havana Nights. I'm also using the square card pack, and also this die set which has been released this month, and it's called Hanami Flowers. So for these cards, the layout is the same, and I'm going to show you how to create the embellishments that you'll need to create the cards. So to begin with, we're going to start with an acrylic block, some distress inks, watercolor paper, and a little water spritzer. So I'm using Blue Print Sketch, and I'm just stamping it over on the acrylic block, followed by Mermaid Lagoon, and after that I am using Cracked Pistachio, and I'm just randomly stamping them in on the block. And now I'm using a mini mister, and you can see that it's creating pooled colors there, which is what we want. And I've cut my paper so that my watercolor paper so that it covers the block, and I'm going to flip that over and press down slightly, and then I'm just going to move it to one side and place something heavy on it, and I'm just going to leave it to air dry for as long as possible. And then while that's drying, we're going to work on some of the other embellishments that we're going to be using to create these particular cards. So I'm using my Misty and some more watercolor paper, and we're going to do some stamping. So I'm selecting one of the clear stamps, and it's this open flower pattern, and some Versamark ink, and we're going to do some stamping. So Versamark ink is a sticky ink which is really great for embossing. So when I use watercolor paper, I like to stamp the image twice and sometimes 3 times. Now, I realized when I was doing this that I forgot to use an embossing buddy, so I'm just going over the paper now with an anti-static powder tool, and now I'm going to continue my stamping. So again, I'm just using the Versamark ink to continue the stamping of the same flower image. I'm going to do this to create about 6 flowers. I like to create extra because you just never know. I do love to use a lot of flowers on my cards, and it's always handy to have more than what you actually need. So I'm double stamping and sometimes triple stamping. So now that the stamping's complete, I'm going to sprinkle some clear embossing powder over the stamped images, over some scrap paper that I've got. So I'm just sprinkling quite a lot of amount and shaking off the excess. And now I'm just going over that and melting that powder with a heat tool, and you can see that I've got 6 stamped flowers on my watercolor paper, and I'm just melting that embossing powder with the heat tool because that is what we're going to use on the card. To colour the flowers, I'm going to be using a fine-tipped watercolor, fine-tipped water brush, and also distress marker. And the distress marker that I'll be using is Mermaid Lagoon. So to start off with, I'm just laying a light layer of colour in the petals, using the embossed edge as a guide. And I'm being consistent with the way that I colour these petals. It's very easy. I just run a line of colour on the edge, and then I just use the water from the brush to pull the color out, and I do the same thing on all the petals. As I'm going around, I'm getting a feel for how the pen and the ink work on the paper, and you'll see that it fades out really nicely. So you'll see that I'm gradually adding more ink because I can see just how much the water is blending it out, and you can see that it's nice and soft. So I'm adding my ink from the marker, and then I'm just blending it out with the water brush, and I do the same direction for all the petals so it looks consistent and it looks really soft, and it's not neat because we just want to get color on these petals. So I'm going to show one more, and I'm doing the same technique. I'm just laying my color on the left and just drawing out the color to the right and just blending it out. So I'm just laying my color on the left, using that embossed edge as a guide, and because it's clear, it looks really nice. Again, I'm just putting my color down and then just using the water from the water brush to soften the color. If you don't have a water brush, you could do this with water and a paintbrush, but it's very convenient just having one of these water brushes in your stash. So it doesn't take much time at all. So you're going to do this for all of the 6 flowers, and just being consistent with that pattern, it just goes really quick, and it's quite relaxing actually, and it doesn't take very long at all to do. So I'm just showing you the last couple of petals, so you can see I'm just doing that same pattern, drawing my color on the left and softening it to the right, and that's it. Next, we're going to use another stamp from the collection, and we're going to stamp it with the Mermaid Lagoon ink and stamp that onto some watercolor paper, and we're going to make 2 flowers, and we're going to use our water brush once more, and using the shape of the flower, we're just going to spread out the ink from the ink pad, and you can see that I didn't get a perfect image, which was intentional. I just wanted to get enough ink and the outline of the petals so that we could spread out the ink to create that first layer. We want to get layers of color to create this next watercolor flower that we're going to create. So I'm just using that watercolor brush, and you can see how easily it's spreading the distress ink, and it's very easy to follow the shape of these petals from this particular stamp from the stamp set. So I'm just going around all the petals and just spreading that ink. It doesn't have to be smooth, it just needs to cover the shape so that we can tell the definition of each of the petals, and that there is enough ink on there so that we have that first layer. And once that's done, we're going to use a heat tool to dry it, and then we're going to use Blueprint Sketch once more, and we're going to add a second layer, and so that's why we had to dry our first layer, because we're going to add more ink, and we're just going to blend out that color that we've just added. And again, we're just going around just adding some ink to the edges and just blending it out, just blending it enough so that we can see some of our first layer and that there's no harsh lines. We want it to look like a watercolor, so having different layers of light and dark, and enough of our bottom color to come through. So I'm not being particularly neat about this because I do want it to look messy. I'm going around in little circles, and also I'm being consistent in the way that I apply my my ink, and I think that really helps to create pretty watercolor flowers as well. So you can see that you don't have to be a watercolor artist necessarily to create pretty watercolor flowers. It's just having just a few little techniques up your sleeve so that you can have fun using stamps and just having a go, and some watercolor paper as well. So that's done. We've got 6 flowers, rather 8 flowers complete, so I'm putting those aside to air dry, and now we're going to move on to our next part. So this is our block with our watercolor background, and you can see how nicely that it's turned out. So I'm just going to dry it and put it aside, because we're going to use it to do some die cutting. So I'm using the Hanami die set to create a really nice die, and don't throw away those little pieces. So again, I'm cutting that same die again with white cardstock. I'm using the outside part of the die, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace the inside of the die with a pencil, because we are going to use it to create another feature for our card. And with some scissors I'm going to fussy cut that out, because we are going to create a really pretty watercolor embellishment using that, and I'll show you what I mean in a moment. It's going to look spectacular. So once I've finished fussy cutting out the outline, I'm going to get that white piece that we cut out, and I'm going to use some glue. I use the Kaisercraft glue, but I put it into a little fine tip bottle, because for little projects like this where I need to do some precision gluing, this really comes in handy. So you can see where the joins are, and anywhere in between that I think it needs adhesion. Really makes it easier to have control over where I apply that glue. So now I'm just going to apply that die cut piece to the background that we've just created. And now we are going to use the watercolor pieces that came out of that first die that we created, and we are going to have something like a jigsaw where we're going to put those pieces and glue them inside this little shape that we've just created. So during this my fingers get very sticky, as you can see. So before I glue, I just dry fit them before I put my pieces into place. And again, this precision little bottle comes in very handy, so that I can apply just enough glue to set the pieces into place. So I'm just showing you now the last couple of pieces, and you can see just how pretty this little embellishment is. So from one die you can create 2 pretty watercolor die cuts, and I really love the way that that looks. So again, we're going back to the stamp set, and using some more of that watercolor background, we're going to do some more stamping. So I'm selecting one of the tile pieces, and I'm just working out here a good place to put it so that I can get maximum coverage. So I'm using my anti-static powder tool, because I'm going to be doing some heat embossing. And so I've just lined it up on my MISTI, and I'm going to use the Versamark ink once more to stamp my tile into place. And again, I like to double stamp, so the MISTI is very handy to allow me to do that with ease. For this particular piece, I'm going to be using white embossing powder, because we want to be able to see the image this time. And so I'm just tapping off the excess powder, and I'm going to heat set it with my heat tool, and you'll see how pretty that looks. I'm going to repeat the same thing again, this time on the green part of the watercolor background, using that anti-static powder tool, and again placing it where I want it, and stamping with the Versamark ink. And of course, as you know, I'll be double stamping, because I want to make sure I have enough ink on this paper, and I'll be using that white embossing powder once more. So there are a lot of steps, but you can see just how much versatility there is when you get these stamp sets. You can use them for so many things. Now I'm going to die cut it, so I want to make sure that I have a nice border around the little tiles. So I've already cut it using some scrap photocopy paper, and so I've just placed that around the actual tile, and then the actual die just nestles back into that space so that I know that my die and the embossed area will align perfectly, so that I've got a nice little even space all around. So I can do that same step once more for the blue tile. I can use my little frame so that I can align my my die. So if you have difficulties aligning dies with stamps, so that's a little tip, just die cut it out of some paper and you'll be able to align it perfectly. Now I've got some vellum, and I'm using an anti-static powder tool again just to clean the surface, and this time we're going to stamp the sentiment onto it. So I'm going to use the Misty once more to do this, and so here I'm just lining it up, and again I'm going to use the Versamark ink to ink it up, because we're going to be heat embossing it with white ink once more. So I'm just making sure I have a good impression here, and everything went very well. So now I can sprinkle the white embossing powder over it, and then again use the heat tool so that I can melt the ink onto that sentiment and get ready to die cut it, which will be the next step. So there are a few steps, but it's worth it in the end. So here I am, I'm just running it through the die cutting machine. So the flowers are all dry. I like to let them air dry, so I'm just going to cut them out, and the next step will just be to fussy cut them out with some scissors. So as you can see, they dried really nicely, and there's some nice variation in the colors, so having the two colors went really well. So I've got the acrylic block once more, and this time I'm using the distress inks and just stamping those three colors in random patterns all over, just so that I can get good coverage. And again, I'm going to use the mini mister to get the beads of color of the ink, which is what we want, so that it can create that beautiful watercolor effect onto that watercolor paper. And you can see that it's already starting to swirl and create that really nice effect, and of course we need to put some weight on it. So here is the card pack. The card base is a blue mat, which is 13 centimeters by 13 centimeters, and the pattern paper is 12.5 centimeters by 12.5 centimeters. When I die cut it, I made sure that there was, or rather when I cut it out with my paper trimmer, I just made sure that there was no white on the outside. To add some dimension, I'm using some foam. So I'm using the craft mat and a ruler and a Kaisercraft craft knife, and I'm using the grid lines as a guide to assist me with my measurements. Now I use a lot of dimensional foam, but because this is such a large area, I thought that I would just use some fun foam to conserve on some of my tape. So I'm just using some double-sided tape here to adhere my foam to the pattern paper layer, and I'm just going to adhere it around the edges and place some in the middle, and I'm going to do that so that I'm sure that nothing will be poking out the side. And now I'm just going to repeat that step so that I can adhere this to the base layer of my card. And when I adhere that, I try to center it as best I can so we can see the tiny blue border. Next there is a white strip which is 12.5 centimeters by 5 centimeters, and just some blue leftover scraps which measures 12.5 centimeters by 2 centimeters. And at this point I'm just eyeballing it. I just want to have a little thin blue border, and so having the liquid glue allows me to have some wiggle room so that I can manipulate it so that everything is roughly even. I'm going to mat this layer with some more foam, and this time I'm just going to use some liquid glue. This will go in the middle of the card. The second card, the format of it is exactly the same. So now I'm just going to play around with some embellishments that I plan to use on this card. So everything is basically just about made, and this is quite quick, this part, because it's just a matter of gluing things into place. Now I've got my card positioned in a way that I can use the grid lines to help me line things up. So I've put my elements in this particular way so that the colors complement each other. I've got the tiles where they are so that they stand out. Again, the little fine tip applicators come in handy to adhere the vellum, which is quite delicate. So I'm very happy with the way that that center panel looks. Now I'm just working out how I want my flowers. So I've decided I want a combination of light and dark, and I'm happy with the way that is. So now I can start gluing things into place, and tucking behind the foam layer really helps. And now I'm just going to add some glue, and I'll use my craft mat as a guide to help me keep things as straight as possible. Things for me are never perfectly straight. Now this is the second layer that we made, and I really love the pattern that it created. I'm going to use another die, and it is called Floral Thank You, and we're going to cut out a sentiment from that to use on the second card. So the layers are the same as the first card, exactly the same, and so I've already put the foam tape and the double-sided tape onto the paper, and now I'm just going to adhere that to the base of my card. I've already put the white strip with the blue together as well. So now we're going to use all the other elements that we've created, and again I'm just playing around with the parts or the embellishments that we've created. Happy with that. So now it's time to glue. So I'm just going to use the little fine tip to glue that Hanami flower onto the background, and I'm only going to do it lightly because I may need to shift it around a little bit. So I'm just pressing it lightly because I want to be able to see the beautiful watercolors. I always like to leave a bit of a gap because I do like to tuck things behind. Again, I'm trying to use the craft mat to help me line things up so that they are relatively straight. And I just really love how the stamps and our watercolor flowers really complement each other, as well as the background paper that we've used. Everything just works. So now the fine tip bottle, I'm just using that to sparingly apply my glue so that we can attach the sentiment, and it really pops with that, having that white there as well. So I'm just adding the flowers, and then I decided I needed to have some sparkle, so I've got some Kaisercraft rhinestones, and I've got silver and ice blue. At this point I struggled because I had so much glue on my fingers. I really should have used a baby wipe to clean them, so rather than sticking to the card, they were sticking to my fingers. It was a bit of a nightmare, and because it was getting towards the end of the day, I was getting a little bit tired. I was getting a little bit lazy as well, so I was just fighting with glue and rhinestones and too lazy to get up to wash my hands or to get a baby wipe. So there you go, I paid the price. I had a fight with a rhinestone. But anyway, all is good in the end. We've got the pretty rhinestones sort of cooperating on the card. So I've started off with the silver and I've just put them on the background, and then I decided that I was going to enhance the flowers with the ice blue. And having the clear background, it's really great. You can audition the size of the size that you want from the pack, and because they are embossed, the flowers are embossed, we need to add just some extra glue to the surface just to make sure that they remain adhered to the card, and they really work well, I think. So it just adds a little something something, I think. So very pleased with the little finishing touches. So that card is now complete. So both cards here, and I'm really thrilled with how they turned out. So I hope you'll give these techniques a go, and I hope you enjoy the tutorial. So thanks again and have a great day.